Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Landon Mitchell Show. I'm your host, Landon Mitchell. I'm a political commentator, activist, and now podcast host. The point of the Landon Mitchell Show is to offer a new socialist perspective on the internet. I'm here today with a very distinguished guest. His name is Dr. Richard Carrier. Dr. Carrier, please go ahead and introduce yourself.
For those who don't know, I'm a historian and philosopher, PhD in ancient history from Columbia University, but I do independent research and public writing and so forth on many issues, philosophical, political, ancient historical, and so on. And I think like one of the reasons that you asked me on is that I do a lot of like tying philosophy to political policy, and I'm a hardcore lefty as well. So um, and of course, I'm well known in the atheist community because I do a lot of counter apologetics and critical thinking work. And so, people who want to know more things about me, I've got lots of books, and I teach classes and all kinds of stuff like that. But to all things me, it's at richardcarrier.info. So it's just my name, richardcarrier.info, and you can find out everything about me there.
Great. Thank you very much. And I'm glad to hear that you're a hardcore leftist. This is the place to be for hardcore leftists. Speaking of philosophy and politics, I guess I wanted to get more into why we discuss politics philosophically. A lot of philosophers aren't interested in politics at all. I remember reading an article by the socialist Ben Burgess, the host of Give Me an Argument, I believe, and he wrote this article talking about the great late philosopher Quentin Smith. And Quentin Smith was a big Heidegger fan. And in Ben Burgess's account, Quentin Smith, being this now analytic philosopher, was just totally oblivious or unaware, whatever it was, to the political import of what Heidegger was saying.
Right.
Obviously, Heidegger was a Nazi and a member of the National Socialist Party, and was deemed a fellow traveler to the Holocaust after the war, which was basically like, okay, you're like a level 3 Nazi, and so the whole idea is maybe analytic philosophers should learn to see how philosophy is tied to politics. So where I like to start is with the famous statement, "I think, therefore I am," uttered by Rene Descartes in Discourse on Method, which he wrote back in the 17th century. And the interesting thing about that statement is he says, well, your mind can be what it is independent of the world around it. You can know that you exist without necessarily affirming the existence of anything else. And I think in reality, we find ourselves in our firsthand experience in quite a different world than the one Descartes describes. In fact, we find ourselves embedded in historical, social, and political situations. As Marx said, history hangs over us like a nightmare. We're born and we have to deal with the past. So it's not as if we're just these minds that can just be what they are, independent of politics and society and whatnot. And I found that to be especially relevant to philosophers because a lot of philosophers are grad students and they get paid very poorly for what they do.
Yeah.
And I was actually involved in the 2020 COLA strikes across the UC campuses here in California.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And some people were paying 70 to 80% of their income on rent, and it's kind of hard to philosophize when you're doing that.
Right.
I think it's pretty clear that philosophers are kind of clearly have to, for pragmatic reasons, care about politics. Right.
Yeah. That's all true. And I definitely agree with that. I think people can tend to not realize how much even their political apathy affects them. And that's even apart from that you get to the fact that it affects a bunch of other people, and you should care about those other people as well, and all of that. But also, personally, it reverberates back to you. The society you create, you still have to live in. And I think a lot of people don't realize the long causal chain consequences of decisions they make politically, the positions they take politically or don't take, come back to haunt them. Essentially, a lot of people don't realize, they don't know, like, the problems they have in their lives. They don't understand how those are tied to politics. And I think when people do discover that, then of course they become, the mind is blown, and now they're an activist because they can't unsee what they've seen, right? Once you learn that. So that side of it is true. And I make the point from the other way around. once you've decided, you really need to care about politics. You need to make sure that you're right because you could be wrong, right? How do you know you're on the right side of it?
Yeah, I think the point that she raised is really valid, and I remember this article I read about a philosophy grad student. Wish I could remember the name. And they were sitting in a seminar on metaphysics, and outside of that seminar, there were Black Lives Matter protesters advocating for the rights and dignity of Black folk, and that kind of really frames the issue, right? Like, why are we doing philosophy when there are so many people suffering that I have to care about, not just philosophers, but the broader community. And I think philosophy can provide us a lot of insight because what philosophy offers us is an important distinction between instrumental and value rationality. We have
Yeah, yeah. Among many
instrumental
other
rationality.
things. Yeah.
Right. Instrumental rationality will say, how do we get from point A to point B? And philosophy, and that's kind of what politics is about. It's about power. How do you use your power to get us from point A to point B, from
Yeah.
capitalism to socialism, whatever it is. And then we have value rationality, which is more the moral kind of rationality,
It's the
which
where
says,
should we go, right? So
yes, exactly, and
instrumental is how
why.
do we get there? The values is where are we going? Like which what should we trying to accomplish? Yeah, totally. And what I point out is, and with regard to like the classroom thing, like obviously the world has to keep spinning, and we still have to keep doing what we're doing. And so my response to things like the BLM protests would be, well, does anybody want to join me after this lecture, right? So you don't have to necessarily stop the presses on everything else that you're doing to also do that, right? So it's not an either or option, but you do need to care. And I think the key thing is like, why do the metaphysics in the first place, right? Like, so isn't that just angels on the head of a pin? And a lot of philosophy is, but not all philosophy, and it's not inherently that. And so what I point out is that once you've decided, like you said, you've got your values, you have your goals, and you want to figure out how to get there. That's your politics, but your politics come from your philosophy, right? So your values come from your philosophy. What you think is an acceptable way to go forward, what methods you use to figure out how to go forward. That's philosophy, and your philosophy. So if you start with your policy, well, I should say it starts with your policy. It comes from your politics, whatever your political views are, which comes from philosophy. And then philosophy comes from your worldview, or defines your worldview, describes your worldview. And that comes from epistemology, right? So you have to get back to it, really does come down to epistemology. But then you have to figure out, like, metaphysics matters because you have to figure out what exists, what doesn't, how does it work, and so on. That matters in terms of what values you choose. It matters in terms of what methods you think will work. Like, we can't pray for hurricanes to go away, right? That doesn't work materially. So metaphysics matters, in this sort of discussion, and ontology, science, aesthetics, ethics, like all of that stuff is tied together. And so I think like philosophers should be building worldviews and defending worldviews and perfecting worldviews rather than focusing solely on isolated problems. I mean, they got to do the isolated problems too, but it needs to be tied back into something that's useful that will then entail things about what we should be doing politically and socially. And so I think that's important. But the big takeaway I get from that I've learned for the last 30 years is that I really focus on evidence-based policy and evidence-based politics, which means that I don't start with an ideology and then decide, let that tell me what my values are or what methods I should use. I ask, like, what is the evidence that works, right? Like, what does the evidence say? So you start with the evidence in terms of when deciding these things, which means we've got to be critical thinkers, which means we've got to be empirical thinkers, and so on. And that all comes from philosophy. So yeah, you got to do philosophy, and philosophers should be. I mean, they're the most skilled at this, right? They're supposed to be. So they should be much more heavily involved in this than they are.
Right. And I agree that it doesn't have to be one or the other. I think the current situation is that academia may not necessarily incentivize its practitioners to engage with the
Right.
public. And I think that's something that has to change. And I think it's something that is changing. And there are a lot of great programs. At my alma mater, UC Santa Cruz, we have the Center for Public Philosophy, and they'll go out and have ethics bowls at San
Yeah.
Quentin State Prison. I think the metaphysical aspect of philosophy that you highlighted is also important. I agree because if you look at, for example, the resurgence of things like Christian nationalism in the United
Yeah.
States of America, one's metaphysical beliefs are going to be very important in terms of how one addresses that, because from the Christian nationalist perspective, they have this metaphysical belief that God is real and he's commanding them to impose Christian morality on society. And if you
Yeah,
believe that, then liberal considerations about religious tolerance just go right out the window,
yeah,
because
right,
you have an
yeah,
edict from God. And so and I think, the new atheist movement has kind of diminished significantly since its height back in, say, 2010 or so. But I think there is space for a sort of a renewed
yeah. So
movements that question these kinds of
I feel like
baseless metaphysical.
the new atheism movement basically just finally broke the glass ceiling, in a sense, and made atheism popular to talk about. So it was really just very rudimentary. It was just getting atheism was like a very hush hush subject in America. Now it's very normal, right? So it's like the amount of atheists has exploded, and it's growing. We're starting to look more like Europe and other first world countries, and I think that's the main thing it accomplished. I don't think it did a good job of tying that back into politics. And give you an example, you mentioned metaphysics. Even atheists have metaphysical problems. For example, once you've abandoned religion, once you've abandoned the supernatural, I notice a lot of atheists still believe in just world theory, right? And a lot of their politics is based on this assumption that the world just works a certain way. It's like the Adam Smith model where, oh, capitalism is just great, right? Like it's the invisible hand takes care of everything. This is a sort of a atheist superstition in a sense. It's metaphysically false, and you can prove it empirically. So it matters metaphysically in terms of how you think the world works, and that follows from what kinds of entities you think exist, and how they would function, right, and that kind of thing. So that's why we have like atheist racism, right? We have racist ideologies that are entirely based on Darwinian concepts, right? I would call them pseudo-Darwinian, but anyway, the point being is that there's metaphysics even on the atheist side still to debate. So even if we could eliminate religion, we're not done, right? So metaphysics still
Yes.
matters at that level. So and I think there's a lot, and I talk about this a lot on my blog. So oftentimes I bring up these issues. I try to tie everything back into philosophy in some way, either to metaphysics, which often I do, or epistemology, and usually both. That's everything. So like you're arguing sexism or racism in society. Like, does it exist? Well, how does it exist? What can we do about it? What should we do about it? These are all important questions, and there are ways to answer them, but you're going to be more capable of answering them if you understand how reality works, and that does start at metaphysics, which starts with science and so on. So, yeah, I think that's important stuff. And well, that's I think the general idea, and I think you had a list of some like examples you wanted to get into. I think.
Yeah, and real quick to get to what you were saying, I think you were one of the early people to realize that atheism needs to address these other issues: sexism, racism, homophobia, and that's why you created the Atheism Plus movement and were involved in the Atheism Plus movement. And I think if many people had gone in that direction, it would have made the movement continue a lot.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah, I think there's a lot of pushback. Yeah, there's a
but
lot
I
of
think
pushback against it. But the concepts are still there. They don't get used under that label anymore. But we do have that sort of battle going on in atheism still, between what are effectively the humanists, even though they don't use that word very much anymore, and the sort of anti-humanists, sort of the proto-fascists, and, right wingers, and so forth, that we also deal with. So we do have that going on. But yeah, no organized movement really formed to do anything about that. So it's really just individuals having the responsibility to do the philosophy, check the facts for real, and learn how to do that. And I think a lot of atheists are bad at that, just like Christians are. And I think so. Part of my job, as I see it, is to teach these critical thinking skills. And so that's what gets me talking about politics, and gets controversial on my blog, because I'm saying, look, it all ties back to epistemology. You've got to go back to the basics of philosophy to answer these questions. You can't just be parroting what the media tells you, or what your favorite pundit says, or whatever, or what you think in the armchair. You could be totally wrong, and you got to find out, right? And so that's what I think is important. And I think what the most recent big example of that was my article, "How Far Left is Too Left," where I was trying to define where I am on the spectrum. It's pretty far left, but not like too far, I guess. I don't know. I'm pretty left compared to most folks. But that article is a good example of what, by exploring the boundaries, you can really explain where you're at and why, right? So even though it's ostensibly about what's too far, in reality, that allowed me to explain where I am and why you should be there too, right? And so that's what I think that got your interest in setting up this brief conversation, because that's an example of doing this philosophy to figure out what our goals should be, where should we be going, and what actually works to get there. Right. So
To go to what you're saying about how many atheists believe that society just kind of works as it does,
right.
it kind of like Adam Smith's invisible hand. I think what that goes to is the sort of enlightenment paradigm that underlines a lot of atheists. Because if you look at somebody like Christopher Hitchens, he made a very adamant call: return to enlightenment values, return to enlightenment values.
Yeah. Although
And
people forget Hitchens was hardcore communist, right? So he wasn't the hardcore Adam Smith type. Like, no, he was on the other side. People forget that. They kind of focus on his supposedly conservative views and ignore all the other politics that he argued. And he did write a lot on that subject. So Hitchens is very
well,
different from like Sam Harris, for example.
the thing about the Enlightenment is that it called for a sort of, to use a Latin term, um, mathesis universalis, right? Like a universal mathematics.
Yeah.
And just as Newton had discovered the laws of physics that govern the motions of planetary bodies, they similarly thought you could find the universal laws that a lot of atheists have sort of inherited this like view of society that it just works as it does. It's kind of like what the critical theorist Theodor Adorno would call naturalization, where you take human social arrangements that can be changed, but you treat them as if they're just natural facts. Like it's as
Right.
if it's the same thing as the sun rising every day. There's just nothing you can do about it. It's just how the world works. And that kind of leads to a very disempowering sort of apolitical mindset where it's just, oh, well, capitalist society, this is just how things work, even though you can clearly denaturalize capitalism by pointing out that
Yeah.
capitalism emerged in the 17th century. It emerged in the 1600s. It's an invention that humans came up with, and just like all the other inventions we've came up with, it can become obsolete. So it's not naturalized in that way, but many people think of it that way.
Yeah, and the same kind of reasoning goes into like the whole gender debate as well. Like people have these assumptions that women are a certain way, men are a certain way, when really most of that is construct, mostly social construct, peer pressure, environmentalism, things, or environmental effects and things. That in fact people can behave differently than their gender roles insist that they should. Even atheists can be trapped in this idea that genders are somehow dictated by sex, when in fact they're
I
not.
wanted
Kind
to
of arbitrary, and that's not the only thing too. Like the ideas that somehow white people could be genetically superior to black people comes from the same kind of thing. Like you're looking at, oh, like natural, it's just natural law, right? That's where you get things like even Sam Harris saying, like, actually falling in with the bell curve people and thinking, like, yeah, actually, why wouldn't white people have evolved smarter brains than black people? It was a very uncritical way of approaching it. But it follows from this metaphysical assumption that the world operates according to laws, and then mistaking the social constructs for the outcome of those laws, when really that's not the case. And the only way to get away from this, the only way to break free of it, is to really take that critical mind and that epistemology, where you have to actually question yourself. No matter how certain you think something is, and you go, but am I wrong? How would I know it if I was wrong? Like that's the key thing I think every philosopher needs to do more, is ask themselves, how would I know it if I was wrong? And then go find out, like actually care about this. And some of my blogs recently, the articles were about this issue, about how a lack of curiosity as to whether you're wrong, and that curiosity that motivates you to genuinely find out, is a bigger problem societally than I had realized until recently. And I started analyzing some cases and realized that actually curiosity is way more important value than I had been. Not that I ever thought it was unimportant. It's just that I wasn't elevating it enough. I think we need to elevate it more than we have been, for that reason, because that drives you to actually question yourself creatively, constructively, productively, rather than
Mhm.
destructively. So productive skepticism instead of destructive skepticism.
Right. And speaking of a topic that so many people got wrong, the 2024 election. I had initially predicted that Donald Trump would win, and I actually called every single state correctly. And
And
it was,
what did you base that on? That's his key. So what was the evidence for you?
if you look at the elections Donald Trump participated in, the polling has always been off by some percentage. And if one just averages um, how far off those polls were, when you looked at the polls saying that Kamala Harris and Trump were tied in swing states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Nevada, etc., and you
Yeah,
consider the facts that the polls have historically underestimated
if you
support for
adjust,
Trump,
right?
it was
Yeah, if you
pretty clear
adjust.
that Trump would be the
So
yeah,
here's a
and
question.
it was also pretty clear that Trump was in a stronger position than he was in 2020. In 2020, he was an incumbent in a pandemic and an economic
So that yeah,
recession,
that's the
and
question
now
I have.
he's running against the failed establishment.
This is how you would test that: is like go look at the polls for the 2020. The polls at the same distance from the election as the ones for 2024, and do the same adjustment, and then see does that work? Would that method also have predicted Biden's win, or would it have shown that Trump would have won? And this is an important distinction because
Mm,
I suspect, and from my reading and looking at listening to pollsters, like actual poll people talking about their profession and the things that you're talking about, one thing that came across very clearly is that there is a large percentage of people, by large I mean like 10%, uh, but they're deciding elections now, that are basically zero information voters. So they actually don't follow the news. They don't care what
yes.
the candidates say. They don't care about policy. They don't care about party. When they go in the voting booth, they just vote how they feel. And their decision is based entirely on how they feel economically, which is largely their perception of the state of the economy. So they just vote the economy and that's it. And
When they
because
go
the
to
United States has driven the world, well, driven its whole population into essentially crisis because we have wage stagnation, um, like huge income disparities, and this has led to widespread corruption and injustices. That the system sucks, and consequently, the economy is always bad, right? From the perspective of these 10% of voters, and so they're always going to vote against the incumbent. It doesn't matter, right? So I suspect that there's, even if Trump could run the next one, he would lose simply because everybody votes angry against whoever's in office. So I think the reason he won in 2024 is that people were just angry at the economy and decided, well, we just got to get rid of Biden. Maybe Trump will fix it, right? It's not a rational decision, but this, if this is true, then this means that they're just Americans are just always going to vote against the incumbent forever now. Until something changes, until like we get a better educated populace or some really radical changes in the way the political field is operating. But right now, I think we're just stuck in that mode. That it's just this small 10% of voters that don't pay attention to anything, and there's no messaging you can change that will reach them because they don't listen to messaging. So there's never messaging. It's just is the economy shitty or not, and that's it. And then they would vote for Caligula's horse. They don't care. And so I think that's my suspicion. That's my hypothesis right now. And so I'm just waiting to see as
Mhm.
evidence grows, or if it can be tested even in the last 20 years about that. Like I'd be curious to know: is this a new phenomenon, or is Bush and Obama, were they unusual? So like because they got two terms back to back, right? So or were people voting the economy because they were happy with the economy or with what they perceived the candidate to have done to the economy when they were in. And so, like the way Obama turned everything around from 2008 made him look good come the next election, and that's why he got reelected. I think the same thing happened with Bush. And so I think it's really just a question of is the economy going to be any good? And then the president has some effect on that. Um, but sometimes they don't, there's nothing they can do about it, right? Like Biden did the most that probably could have been done to get the economy in a good position. But people don't see that, right? Like that requires looking at metrics that will only pay off years later. And so the average public
Right.
doesn't see that. What they see is the price of eggs, right? Like it's that kind of like reaction to things. Anyway, that's a hypothesis, and so I am interested in exploring the evidence as I get around to it. I think we'll have to wait a few more elections to see.
Yeah, and there are a lot of things to address there. And so, as for the method that I used to predict the Trump victory, it would have predicted a Biden victory. And I'm basing that on Nate Silver's observation and his
Right.
model for the 2020 election. He said, well, if you take the standard size polling error that has occurred in every election in history, and we experienced a standard size polling error in 2020, then Biden would still win. because Biden
Right.
was so far ahead in the polls that even with a standard size polling error, he would still be ahead of Trump to get enough
Right.
electoral votes to
Yeah.
win.
Yeah. And I
Uh,
think Nate Silver also called it for Trump in 2024. And that was his thinking in both cases as well.
yeah, I believe that's correct. I believe he did predict a Trump victory. Um, and I think when you mentioned the value of curiosity, that's really applicable to what you were saying about these low
Yeah.
information, low propensity voters that Trump brought in 2024. Because leftists like to talk a lot about social constructs, but I think part of the problem actually cannot be solved by thinking of things in constructionist terms. Although I think that paradigm is obviously very useful, but what I would say is I think some people um, just have neurophysiological states that lead them to not value cognition in the first place. They would rather have a strong authority figure like Donald Trump to just
Yeah.
tell them what they should do. And it's a kind of evolutionary survival strategy, in my opinion. It kind of says, hey, why take the time to be like Richard Carrier and get a PhD when I could just let Trump tell me what to do and that solves
Yeah.
everything,
I,
you
I
know?
think what you're describing is what you would call a default, right? So if you just have a human who's operating on evolutionary defaults and they're not being educated, they're not being trained, they're not being influenced culturally to have a different attitude. Because then you look at certain other countries, you get more interested populace than Americans. Like Americans have a high level of disinterest compared to other countries. And that can't be biological, right? That's cultural. That means that there's something wrong with our education system. There's something wrong with our cultural value system. The kind of values that we're encouraging in people are not conducive to getting people out of the default mode. I think civilizations work better when they actually push, create systems to like drive people out of the default mode to make them better than that. And you don't have to go for a PhD to do that, right? You just have to be a critical thinker, and the set of skills you need is very simple. It's not complicated, and it doesn't take a whole lot of effort. It takes some time for sure, but it doesn't require the this. I think there's very few people that couldn't do it. Is what I'm saying. They just don't know that they could, and aren't being encouraged to, and so they don't. And what do we get? Is this right? I think that's. So I think you're right about the default mode, but I think everybody can get out of the default mode. We just need to build a society that nudges them out more. And so, so that's my view on that.
Yeah, and I think there's a problem with our political system too, where
Yeah,
people are feeling disenfranchised, and disenfranchised people aren't interested in politics anymore.
that's right.
And
Yeah.
um,
Mhm.
that really, I've talked to people who are really into different conspiracy theories about vaccines or food or whatnot, and not to evaluate whether or not those are accurate. But I talk to them and I say, well, people always want to blame the elites in a very populist way. But the fact of the matter is that we could all stop this, but we don't. And so, in that way, it's not just the elites who are to blame, it's everyday people. But the everyday people are too afraid to take on the system because a lot of people think they're that they're going to get harassed or even killed if they speak up because the political climate is so violent. And so I think there's a whole lot of disenfranchisement in our political system, and Donald Trump has been so good at bringing those people into elections, and Democrats haven't been. I mean, I supported Harris, but I was extremely frustrated the entire time because she really came out of the gate with a lot of energy, great speeches, well attended rallies. But the problem was she was so afraid to distinguish herself from the unpopular Biden administration. And I don't know
Yeah.
if that was because of her or her team, but I remember 3 days before the election, she was talking about how Trump had said, "Oh well, Liz Cheney should have to stand in front of the barrels of a gun and see what that's like." People often send others to wars that they aren't willing to fight themselves, and she spent the remainder of the election talking about how that was some kind of death threat. And I was just thinking, is this seriously what you're talking about to try to win the election? Because what she really needed was something that was going to differentiate herself from Biden and was going to bring in, low propensity voters who are done with the system. And she didn't do that. Oh yeah, Goldman Sachs loves my economic policies, which is one of the most out of touch statements somebody make in politics. It was just really frustrating to watch.
The function of that is because of this perception. So there's been this playbook that both parties have been running. In fact, Trump is the first one to break it. Both parties run this playbook. There's this assumption that there are these centrists or these moderates that somehow they can convince, right? And so they have to not seem to be too extreme, and try to appeal to two different markets, essentially, right? So the whole Goldman Sachs thing, that's the whole like, oh yeah, there's supposedly 30, 40 million voters who care about that. We better get them, right? And that's how they think. I don't think that that's true. And so I think the reality is that I think the left should go more left. The fear is, this is what happened with the Biden administration, is that they needed to court doubters, people who were not so hot for Biden. And there are various reasons why that are not entirely wrong. But so what they did is they appealed to these so-called moderates rather than going full left, right? If they could have gone full left, they could have gone AOC, right? They could have done, the all the way. And Democrats argue about messaging, right? They argue about, oh, we should have toned down our too leftist stuff, and then the two leftist people say, no, you should have toned down the too moderate stuff. And I don't think it matters. I think the base is going to vote for you no matter what. And if you actually get out there and take these so-called extreme ideas that are supposedly going to scare off voters, if you advocate them and actually explain to them why they're a good idea, right? And then when the Republicans do their attacks and stuff, respond to the attacks and say like, yeah, they're wrong. Here, let me show you that they're wrong. You're trying to scare you off of this, but no, really, our policies are better, and here's why. And so I think if they just owned it and went for it, I think there's a fear, like you said, they're afraid to do that. They're afraid to step full left because they're afraid that that's going to lose them an election. But that's a perception. They perceive that to be the case. I don't think it's objectively the case. I think they could go way more left, and it would barely move the needle election-wise. I think, though, my hypothesis is they're going to vote the election no matter what happens. But when I say they're going to vote the election, I mean it's those 10% people that don't even pay attention to what you say. So your messaging is useless, right? So if your messaging is useless, you might as well just go full on. Like, don't be afraid to actually defend the things that you think really should happen. Just do it, right? If you're, universal basic income. Let's do this. Like we could go to an Eisenhower tax regime when we had the greatest economy in American history, and then universal basic income solve like tons of problems. We could get rid of a lot of Social Security, even like all that stuff, because UBI would cover, like it would supplement. It wouldn't be the same, and then everybody would have this safety net, and they would have tons of money to spend. So even the capitalists love it. So UBI is actually, and so there's a lot of evidence actually you could appeal to this. No, all the things that you feared, and all the things that the Republicans say that UBI would be bad, it's all been empirically disproved, like we've actually run tests. We actually have empirical data showing that it's all false. It actually would be great. And so like, if you just defend it, like just get out there and defend it. Don't be afraid of being called an extremist. I think that's what the Democratic Party is still stuck in, is being afraid of being called extreme. They should just own it. Like if they're right, like if I really believe this and I can prove it with evidence, then I don't care if you call it extreme. That's what I'm gonna stand for. That's what makes us different from the other party. So I think that's what they should do. I don't know any way, myself personally, I don't know any way to get them to do that. So I don't know if that's going to happen anytime soon.
Right. And Democrats are afraid of socialism. And the irony is, when Republicans criticize Democrats for socialism, all they do is to make Democrats look good. I think it was Lauren Boebert who was like, yeah, they're like, oh yeah, Democrats, they're going to give you health care and they're going to fix the roads. It's a nightmare. And then everyone just making fun of it. Like, these are all amazing ideas, and the Democrats believe in that. I'm voting for them. So every time Democrats go to the left,
what you did just there, this is a good example.
Their good ideas.
Yeah, like you take like those 20 words you said just right there, just then when I chuckled. In 20 words, like you did it, right? So you diffuse the Republican attacks, and converted them into votes for the Democrats, right? Like that's the kind of messaging the Democrats need to do, right? Is that kind of thing. Is like, let them attack us for being socialists. That'll give us a perfect excuse to actually point out how much everybody loves socialism, right? It's like, actually, you're benefiting from socialism. Socialism is great, right? It doesn't have all the negative effects that they claim. And so it actually, you could use that, leverage it to sell it rather than to try to avoid it. Say, oh, no, we're not really socialists or whatever. And
Right.
that's that
And that's
fear.
like Bernie Sanders rhetoric, right?
Yeah,
That's exactly what he does. He says, "Yes, I'm a
yeah,
socialist," and what that means is kids aren't going to go to school starving, and it just gives you the platform
yeah,
to put forward these ideas because people say, "Why are you a socialist?" And you just say, "Because I think kids shouldn't be starving when they're trying to learn." And one of the greatest and earliest supporters of UBI was the great American Thomas Paine, and
yeah.
we can steal some of that patriotic energy back from the Republicans and say, yeah, look at this great radical American founding father who
That's
said that
right.
we should
Yeah,
have UBI, and it
yeah,
would be amazing. And to get to back to the Biden administration, I think there were some serious problems that kind of laid the groundwork for Trump coming back. And I think it's he's done some great things, but there's also a very dark underbelly behind a lot of what's going on. For example, the CHIPS Act. The CHIPS Act is great industrial policy. America has much more of a comparative advantage in producing things like steel, and people like Ro have been talking about that since at least 2013. And we need more people like Ro as future leaders because we don't have any leaders right now. And the downside of that is what people don't understand is that these semiconductor plants, the production process is actually radioactive. It can actually give people cancer. My mom worked at a semiconductor factory in Orlando, Florida, owned by a company called Gear Systems. And that's where she actually developed breast cancer because she was a technician working on these computer chips.
yeah,
And
yeah,
yeah, when you're mining ore and processing it and
yeah.
using it to make computer chips, there's
There's a
radioactive
lot of
rocks.
toxic chemistry going on too. So chemical waste is an issue. Yeah, I mean, obviously, yeah. So the question becomes, to what extent is the government on top of that as an issue
Right.
versus just, oh well, let's just not pay attention to that and just build the chips factory. Doesn't matter how many children it eats, as long as it produces the chips that we want. Yeah, that kind of idea. Um, and that relates to the same thing about fear, right? So they're afraid. So like if Biden were to say that, right, to say like, okay, yeah, we're going to do the Chips Act, but I'm going to put into the bill like these requirements for worker safety to deal with and environmental stuff, like to make sure that we don't have too much radioactivity affecting workers, and we don't have too much toxic chemical pollution, etc. And then they're afraid that then the Republicans are going to attack them over environmentalism, yada yada, and they don't do it. And I think no, they should do it and defend it, right? They should just fucking do it and argue like, yeah, no, this is good, and here's why, and then bring out people like your mother and stuff like that, and say like, yeah, look, we have actual empirical evidence that this is a problem, and you out there, the voter, you don't want to work at a place that's going to be irradiating you, right? You don't want your kids playing in the backyard where there's toxic waste that's going to give them cancer or other illnesses. So yeah, of course we're going to do this. Why are the Republicans even against it, right? That they really should just defend their position rather than try to hide the position out of fear that they're going to lose votes.
There's a similar issue with the money that I don't remember the law that off the top of my head, but all the money that's been invested into building solar panels too, because while solar panels can address the issue of carbon emissions, they don't address the issue of habitat destruction, and that's an
Yeah,
extremely important issue as well.
yeah,
And to build enough solar panels to give every American household a solar panel, you'd have to just wipe out entire habitat.
yeah, yeah. And there's a lot more
And
to that
you
too.
also aren't considering the labor.
I wrote an article a
So
while ago
there's so
about.
many solar panel installers who are working like in 100-degree weather to build these solar panels, and they aren't getting
Yeah,
paid very well. And
that's
people
right.
don't
Yeah.
talk
Oh
about
yeah.
stuff like
Yeah, there's actually a death rate too. There's like a fixed death rate. Workers who get killed on the job building solar panels. So that's an actual
that.
factor. So I wrote an article about nuclear power where I go into a lot of these metrics, including ones that people don't think about in terms of Yeah, solar has its place, but we're not gonna replace everything with solar or wind. Like we're not gonna be able. We really there are other things we're gonna have to do, and we really have to commit to them. But so anyway, that's
Yeah,
a whole other
I
issue
think
there. But yeah, there's a
shortcoming
lot
of
going on
Biden
there that we have
admin,
to pay attention to.
the shortcoming of the Biden admin is that we needed an organizer in chief, not just a commander in chief. With
Yeah,
prices going up, what we
yeah,
needed to do, in my opinion, is follow the example of Walter Reuther. Walter Reuther, the union leader, he went in. They didn't just get higher wages for the workers. They didn't just get better benefits for the workers. What they did was they kept prices down. They made sure that when they got their benefits and their pay, that the consumers didn't take on that cost, that the producers did.
yeah, yeah,
And the
yeah. That's the
price
kind of stuff that needs to be done.
and that's how we get some of that 1% money back to the people. And
Yep.
I don't think Biden was visible enough in doing that,
No.
and that contributes to the inflation that ultimately led to his to the reelection of
Yeah.
Donald Trump in
Yeah.
2024.
Yeah, I think that's true. I don't really know that he could have solved it fast enough for the election, but I agree that had he focused more on that kind of thing, it would have been better, even if he hadn't been elected, right? So, like, even if he still lost, the benefits to the public would have been greater, right? So he didn't really shouldn't have to think about, am I going to get reelected? You should think about the things I do, the policies. Are they going to leave the world better off than the world would have been had I not done it? Right? Like that's the kind of thinking that I think Biden should have engaged in more, rather than thinking about what do I need to do to get reelected. And I don't know. I think if liberal politicians did that more often, people would start to trust them more, and they would get more votes for that reason.
On that note, I have one final question for you. As a historian, you've written about Adolf Hitler in the past,
Hmm.
and a lot of times Donald Trump is compared to Adolf Hitler, and I'm wondering what you think about that comparison, because
Yeah,
I think there are relevant analogies and disanalogies to the Weimar
yeah,
era and the Nazi era in Germany and what we're going through now. So what are some of the similarities and differences for you as a historian?
yeah. I think people know the similarities, right? The populism, the leveraging of racism and public fear, the trampling constitutional stuff, the imperial presidency, like pushing it to the max, and all of these kinds of decisions, and the public being sort of like, um, I don't know, like voting out of like terror at the sort of boogeymen that have been invented. It's all of that is analogous. This analogy, though, is interesting. Is that although Hitler was not super competent, I mean, famously he made a lot of really bad decisions, but he was a much more intelligent person than Trump. If you look at like just in the last, I mean, God, it's only been a couple months, right? Like the chaos that has happened in the last couple months.
Mhm.
If you just think about like his behavior with the tariffs, I mean, even apart from the argument over whether there should be tariffs or what they should be, etc., he keeps imposing them and pulling them and threatening them, imposing them and pulling them and threatening them, so that no one even knows whether the tariffs are on or off, right? Like, and then it's just creating this sort of chaos. Reflects a profound stupidity. Like he doesn't understand what he's doing, right? Hitler was smarter than that, right? Hitler could organize better. Hitler could actually make better, like long-term plans that would actually work, right? Hitler was better read, right? Like Hitler was an actual, he actually read things. And that's, I think, is it obviously, I think they're both very similar in terms of their morals and mindset, right? But I just think that Trump is like Hitler with a lobotomy, and so it's hard to decide whether that's better or worse. Quite frankly, on the one hand, it means that he can't accomplish some
Yeah.
things, and we saw that in his first term. Like there's a lot of these nightmarish things he was going to do, and he just failed to do them because he was just not capable, he was incompetent, right? So it kind of saved us from worse things, and so now he's trying to do it again, but now he's doing it even worse, right? Even more incompetently, and so and it's causing havoc. It's going to kill a lot of people, but so it's bad in that sense. But I don't know that if I don't know that I would want a smarter Trump, because then we would have Hitler, right? So
Mhm.
so that that's my sort of general take. I could go into a lot more detail in terms of particular analogies and disanalogies, as you said, but what is your take? Like, what would be one analogy and disanalogy that you would apply apart from what I just said?
I think, yeah, because I think, like you said, the similarities are kind of obvious to most people. But I think one of the key disanalogies that I like to harp on is kind of a chip on my shoulder is changes in monetary policy compared to the 1930s and 1940s.
Hmm.
For example, back in the 1930s, we didn't understand how to control inflation the way we do
Right.
now. Now we
Yeah.
have the Federal Reserve, and the Federal
Because
Reserve,
of that, by the
especially
way.
under Janet Yellen, did,
Yeah.
yes, because of that. Janet Yellen has under her tenure did a controlling inflation. If they wanted the rate to be at a certain percentage, it would be around there. And so I don't think we're in like this hyperinflationary like Weimer-esque kind of situation where prices are so high that it leads to something like Hitler. I think that's one of the key differences. I think things are easier to stabilize than they were back then. I think that'd be
Yeah.
one of the key differences for me.
Yeah, that, and also the one thing that the Republicans are complaining about and that Trump is trying to fix with catastrophic effect is that the government is so much larger. And so the interested parties are very broad. So, like Hitler's ability to take over the military, for example, that was easier. He was in a position that was easier for him to do. I don't think that Trump could do it. He's tried. Like he's got his lackey now in as the Department of Defense guy, but I don't think that guy's going to really persuade a lot of the mainstream brass in the military. Like I think if Trump were to try and pull something that like Hitler did, like the military would say no. At some point, there'd be a breaking point, and they would say no. And I think that's because it's so large and so diverse in terms of who's in command and their values and expectations. They're not really aligned with his vision. They have sort of loose ideas. Even if they voted for Trump, that doesn't mean that they're like already at Mein Kampf level, right? So that's the thing, is like Hitler cultivated the military ideologically before he took it over, right? So that that it was prepared to join him. And so in a lot of ways, not just the anti-Semitism stuff, the military had interests, its own interests that he was wisely exploiting. And Trump doesn't even have the intelligence to do that. He doesn't know what the military's interests are, right? And so that's part of the difference too. And I think also the fact that we
Yeah.
have a citizen soldiery, like our military is so full of people that are just temporarily there. And so that to the extent that like they're actually so fully integrated, and so many of them, that it would be really hard to like get them all marching in lockstep, goose step, or whatever, to any kind of nefarious scheme.
Yeah.
So, like, if he was really to just say invade Greenland or invade Panama, I think we would get a constitutional crisis where the military would just say no, and then that would be that, right? So, in a similar way, like I talk about Putin in Russia, like people are afraid that Putin will launch a nuclear missile, and I think even though like he's very successful in terms of actually keeping his thumb on power, and he's completely wrecked his country and stays in power and has everybody afraid of him and all of that, and a lot of the people believing all of his bullshit and everything. It's like he's kind of what Trump wants to be. And yet even Putin, I suspect, if he were ever to order the launch of a nuclear missile, they would just slit his throat. Like that would be the end of Putin. And I think he knows that too. He knows that he couldn't do it because his people would at that point say like, you know what, I'm not following you down this hellhole. Because then now this missile is going to come back and kill my people and not, my family and me or whatever. So I think he doesn't really have, like, he rules through fear. He doesn't really rule through respect, so that he doesn't have that kind of command structure where they go, oh yeah, it must be a good idea to launch a nuclear missile now. No, they know it wouldn't be a good idea, right? So like that's why his generals and stuff fail so badly in Ukraine. That's why it's such a comedy show, is that he can't put competent people in there, and he's trying to put lackeys in there, but lackeys don't know what they're doing. Whereas the people who do know what they're doing don't do the things that he wants them to do. And so, in a similar way, like what the Republicans call the deep state, which just means patriotism, patriots who believe that the government is more important than a man, and they're going to stand up and
following the law.
Right. Yeah. And Trump's trying to create confusion over which laws are good or bad and which laws we can break or not. But I think he has limits to how far he can pull that game, whereas Hitler didn't. Like Hitler was smarter in terms of how he distorted and altered the legal regime that gave him power, and how he got the public on his side, and how he got the military on his side, and how he got the industrialists on his side, and so on. He's just smarter about it, and I don't see Trump succeeding at it. As much as he's created this cult, and as much as he's got the lackeys who won't say no, it's not enough, and he's not smart enough to get the kinds of inroads that he needs. And I think that's the biggest difference, really.
Yeah. And I think, Hitler built his own military. He had a paramilitary force. And
Yeah,
of
right.
course, that's going to make things much easier to,
Yeah,
to have a military on your side when you've literally
that's right.
built one up from scratch. And,
That's
of
right. Yeah,
course, there's all these far right groups like the Proud Boys, whatever it is, operating in America, but they've never done anything or are capable of doing anything like Night of the Long Lives. Night of the
yeah,
Long
right.
Knives, excuse me.
As we have the proof of January 6th, which was, as horrific as it was a shit show of incompetence. As much as the Proud Boys think they're awesome, they botched that. Like they totally botched that. And can you imagine? Like Hitler would be embarrassed if his people did so poorly at a coup, right? Like he would like, no, you're supposed to actually succeed, motherfuckers. So like,
Yeah.
that's that's because there isn't any actual coordination between Trump and them. Like Trump will praise them, he'll dog whistle them, he'll gloat in their support, and he'll give them hints that he will pardon them or whatever, right? Like he'll do all that, but he's not actually involved, right? Like, he doesn't actually do backdoor meetings with them. He doesn't engage in long term plans with them or anything like that. That's what I mean. Like by Hitler, like was smarter about that. Like he thought about things and he had long term plans, and like he built his influence networks and got them in the right place. And so like it was a it was a process. Trump doesn't do that. Like he just rides around on his pony and with he's more like Mussolini, frankly. Like if we're gonna compare him to World War II tyrants, like it's more like Mussolini. Like
Mhm.
he's more incompetent, but puffs his chests and acts like he's as great and brilliant as Hitler, or he thinks Hitler is, or whatever.
Right. I think the Marx quote is apt here. History repeats itself versus tragedy twice as farce. Hitler was the tragedy. I think Trump is the farce. And,
Yeah,
I think with everything he's doing in terms of tariffs, deportations, um, and I kind of see some big increases in prices promised, and he's not going to deliver. And I think if Democrats are willing to push for socialism, they'll have a governing trifecta by 2028.
hmm
And with that, I think it's time to wrap it up.
yeah,
I think we need more time. I think I'd love to have you back on the show to talk about a lot of
yeah.
other topics.
You bet. Anytime.
Well, thank you very much for appearing on the show, Dr. Carrier. It was very great to talk to you.
Yeah, it was nice.
And
It's great. I like getting the opportunity to talk about this subject. I don't get asked to very often. So
yes, for sure. All right. Well, thank you again. Thank you for your time. You have a great rest of your day, Dr. Carrier.
yeah, you too.